What's going on, everyone? Hello, Ego here with EDMProd, and today we're going to be talking about 10 essential drum patterns that every producer should know how to make. I don't care what genre you produce, at some point in your production career, you're going to end up using at least a few of these patterns, if not all of them. In addition to the patterns, I'm also going to discuss the types of samples that we use, because sample selection is very important, and also some general tempo ranges for the genre. We're going to start off with one of the most common drum patterns, and that is 4 on the floor. This is most commonly found in house music, and you can see here I've started with a tempo of 128. Let's just take a listen to this, and then we'll break the pattern down. It's a fairly simple drum pattern, but because it's so commonly used, it's a very important one. Let's break this down one instrument at a time. And many of these samples I actually pulled out of the free EDMProd sample packs, which are available on EDMProd.com. Got a link in the description if you want to go check those out. We're going to start off with the kick. The kind of kick that I wanted to use for this is one that's got a really nice sharp transient, a very electronic sounding kick. And all you have to do here is put one kick on beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, and beat 4. Just so we get that repeating quarter note kick that holds this groove down. If you want, you can also double the kicks up on the last measure of the phrase, like that. The next sound we're going to add in is a clap. And this clap we're going to place on the 2 and the 4 of every measure so that it happens on every other kick drum. The last essential element of this beat is this hat. I found a pretty nice sounding little clicky hat for this one. Again, that comes from the House Starter Kit EDMProd pack, and I'm going to basically alternate back and forth between the kick and the hat so that the hat is happening on the offbeat, or the and of each one of the quarter notes. So we have kick, hat, kick, hat, kick, hat, and they just go back and forth like that. So that's the basics of this 4 on the floor pattern, but you can also add some other sounds in that really spice this beat up. I encourage you to explore and try and see what you can do to make all these patterns we're going to go over today a little more interesting, a little more unique, and a little more personal to your own particular style. I thought that a cymbal crash on the 1 sounded pretty nice. That kind of helps just, to notate each of the 4-bar phrases. So every time a 4-bar phrase goes around again, we get another cymbal crash right on the 1. I also put a little splash cymbal here on the and of beat 4 of the second measure. So if you look up here, we've got measure 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then over here, we've got 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. Those are the quarter notes. So if this length of time here is a quarter note, and we divide it again, we get an eighth note and an eighth note. So this little splash cymbal is starting on the second eighth note of beat 2.4. The last thing I added were these kind of maraca type sounds. And I have the velocity turned down a bit lower on these. I don't want them to be too prominent of a sound. I just want them to add a little bit of shuffle in here. So feel free to explore whatever you want to do with those little maraca, or you could try shaker sounds. Something like that just adds a little bit of that extra top end groove and shuffle and flow. This is by no means any kind of a standard pattern. You don't have to copy this. You can if you'd like to, but like I said, I encourage you to explore and try and find some other patterns that work really well for your tracks. All right, moving on to the second drum pattern. We got drum and bass. Now for this genre, you're usually going to be writing between 160 and 180. I chose 172. So this is a pretty fast pattern. It's got a lot of energy, a lot of forward momentum. Let's break it down starting with the kick. So for drum and bass, you're usually going to find a kick on the 1, and then a kick on the and of beat 3. I also added a kick on the end of beat 4 in the second measure. I just thought that sounded pretty nice. You don't necessarily have to do this. And if you notice over here, I left that kick out. Again, a personal preference. I could just as easily add that kick in here at the end as well. I got all of these drums out of the EDMProd D&B starter kit sample pack. For me, when I'm making drum and bass, I just like really nice tight drums, but there's all different styles of D&B. You've got liquid, neurofunk, jump up, jungle, deep drum and bass, which is kind of between neurofunk and liquid. And all of these are going to use different types of sounds. So really it just depends on your own personal preference and the subgenre that you're making. The next important part of this is the snare. And you can hear I kind of chose like almost a rim kind of sounding snare. Doesn't really have like that big splashy dubstep snare sound. It's really tight, kind of got like almost acoustic sound to it. Nice sharp snare. And we're going to place that on the 2 and the 4 of every measure. Now the kick and the snare are going to play off each other. Those two have a very important relationship in drum and bass. The last thing I did here was I added 2 different types of hats. We have a louder hat on every single 8th note, and that's alternating with a softer hat on the offbeats. So basically on the 2nd and 4th 16th note of every measure. So if you remember earlier I was talking about how this is 1/4 note, this length is 1/8 note, that means that this is 1/16th note. Meaning you divide every beat into 4. In every measure, there's going to be 16 16th notes. In every measure, there's going to be 8 8th notes, and there's going to be 4 1/4 notes. I added these 2 alternating hats because I just kind of like the shuffle and the flow and the energy they gave. Let's start just by adding in hat 4 on the 8th notes. Then we'll go ahead and add in hat number 6 on the 2nd and 4th 16th notes. And you can hear that just gives it a little bit more of a shuffle, a little bit more of a flow. I think that having that second hat in there really helps to amp up the energy of this beat. And this beat is all about energy. Up next, we've got the halftime or dubstep pattern, which sounds like this. The tempo for this genre can range anywhere from 130 to 150 BPM, sometimes even going as high as 160. 140 is a very common tempo here, but for this I just chose 150. And this genre is usually defined by more sparse kicks, heavier snares. Let's start by looking at the kick pattern. I just put a kick on beat 1 of every measure, and I decided to add another extra kick right here on the 4th beat of measure 2. This is totally up to you, whether you want to add this or not. There's a lot of flexibility in the drum pattern for dubstep. I am primarily a dubstep producer, and I find myself doing all kinds of different patterns here. But the basics is just a kick on the 1 of every bar. Next, we're going to add a snare on the 3 of every single bar. Having the snare on the 3 instead of the 2 and the 4 is what gives it the halftime feel. Let's take a listen to how this sounds with the snares in the 2 and the 4, just so you know what I mean when I say halftime. So you can see when the snares on the 2 and the 4, we don't have that openness to the beat. And the dubstep genre is really about having that nice, spacious, open beat and that kind of slower 1-2 halftime feel. Snares are back on the 3 of each measure. Let's go ahead and add in some shakers and tambourines. So I just got a tambourine sound here. This could easily be a hi-hat as well. It's really up to you. So the first one on beat 1, 2, 3, and 4 of each measure is a little bit quieter. The velocity's turned down a little bit. And the second one for each beat is a little bit louder. I also left this area at the end open here. That's oftentimes where I'm going to put a fill or some kind of weird little turnaround sound, just something to kind of put a punctuation mark on the phrase. I also doubled the speed of it right here. I just thought it sounded nice to have that little shuffle right at the end of the second bar. The last thing I added was this shaker. And you can see what I did with the velocity here was the opposite of the tambourine. So I had the first shaker, which is on beats 1, 2, 3, and 4 of every measure, be a little bit louder than the shaker that is on the second eighth note of every measure. This is very open to interpretation. It's very open to whatever you want to do in terms of the velocity. I just thought this sounded pretty nice, and I wanted a little bit of contrast with that tambourine. Let's take a listen to see how that sounds. Moving along to genre number 4, we've got hip-hop. Hip-hop is commonly going to be found at 85 to 95 BPM, somewhere around there. I chose 90 for this, just something right in the middle of that. Now, right away, you can see there's something a little bit different about this one than the previous 3 patterns that we've gone over. I have a lot of these sounds a little bit off the grid. You can see that this kick's a bit delayed. These hats are a little bit ahead of the beat. So what a lot of hip hop producers will do is actually use a drum pad or something like an MPC and play the patterns in by hand. Or they'll use real acoustic kit samples that are recorded and played by actual drummers. That's going to give the beat a little bit more of a human feel. Usually I find that hip-hop drums sound best when it's not all squarely on the grid. You've got a little bit of movement and flow and variation in that pattern. So I encourage you to play around with either the grooves in Ableton, which can be found over here in the browser. If you open up the groove pool, you can just go down here, find yourself some hip-hop grooves. There's plenty that come with Ableton. Drag them into the groove pool, and then go down here to the side and add this to your pattern. That's going to help to give your pattern a little bit more of a human feel. Or you can do what I did and just program these in by hand and move them around a little bit until it sounds good to you. Starting off with the kick. I just found a hip hop kick. It's got like a dark, thumpy feel to it. I usually don't go for kicks that have a really, really sharp attack or sound very electronic. I always want to find something that's got a little bit more of like a old sampled feel to it, or something that's a bit darker. Something's got a lot of body and thump. I'm going to turn off the accent kicks to start off with and just focus on the main kicks here. So I have a kick on beat 1 of measure 1, and then beat 3 and the and of 3, or the second eighth note of 3. I've got another on beat 1, measure 2, beat 3 of measure 2, the and second eighth note of beat 3 as well, and then the and or second eighth note of beat 4. That sounds like this. Now let's go ahead and add in the little accent kicks or the pickup kicks. And I've got these placed on the eighth note right before beat 3 of each measure. And I delayed these in time a little bit as well, pulled them back so they're not squarely on the grid. And that's going to give it a little bit more of a swing kind of feel to it. You can also turn the velocity down on these 2 little accent kicks, because oftentimes when drummers play that, they're not going to be hitting it quite as hard as the main kicks. Next, I've added in this snare. Kind of a drum machine, realistic, downsampled-y sort of snare. Got a nice crunch, good punch to it. You could also go for like an 808 style snare here. Something like that will work really well. I have my snare on the 2 and the 4 of every measure. And then I've got a few softer accent snares scattered throughout here. Let's start by turning the accent snares off and listening to just the main snares. Notice that I've got a couple of these moved ahead of the beat. The reason I put them ahead of the beat and not a little behind the beat is because I wanted that snare to feel like it's driving the beat forward. Now we're going to turn these accent snares on so you can see what they add. You can try adding these snares in some other places too, just to kind of see how they sound. Definitely feel free to explore. Next thing I got in here is a simple 808 hat. Just a nice basic hat, something to kind of carry the groove and keep it moving forward. Again, you can see a lot of these are moved slightly ahead of the beat. Same reason as the snare, just to keep it going, keep a little more energy here. If you look at the velocity for each of these hats, they're a little different all the way through, just to give it more humanization, more of like a played in or live feel. And the icing on the cake is a TR-808 crash. Any kind of crash will work. I just chose the 808 since I was using an 808 hat, and I've got this mixed pretty quiet as well. Up next, we have the techno pattern. Now, techno is a very wide and varied genre. There's lots of subgenres within techno. You've got deep techno, tech house, which is kind of between house and techno, minimal techno, tribal, tech trance, which is kind of between trance and techno. There's lots of different subgenres, and the tempo range could be anywhere from 120 BPM up to 150. For this, I just chose 130, which is a very common tempo for your meat and potatoes techno. Let's take a listen to this pattern. This is a bit of a 4 on the floor pattern as well, kind of like the house pattern we were talking about earlier, but the kick is going to be a little bit different here. Techno kicks are going to be generally a lot longer than house kicks, and often have a very clear, almost sine wavy type sound with a really long tail, and a pitch decay as well. You can see how this waveform gets slower and slower as it goes. That means the pitch is going from higher down to lower. Just like 4 on the floor, the kick goes on every quarter note of every measure. The next most important element is the offbeat hat. So I just chose this little techno hat. Really, you can use whatever you want here. If you want, you can use a much shorter sound. This is kind of almost like either a long closed hat or a short open hat, but it does sound very electronic, like it was made with a synth or a drum machine, something like that. And I just put this on the second eighth note of every beat. So they go back and forth with the kick. The third thing that I added to this pattern was a little teeny tiny closed hat. I wanted something very short and very clicky, and I'm going to put one of these on every 16th note of the bar. You can see I kind of like left one out here. If you want to get really proper at this, then you'd probably not have one of these hats when you have the more open hat type sound, because technically those two shouldn't happen at the same time. Most drum kits only have one hat, and therefore the drummer is only going to play either an open or a closed hi-hat. So there you go. Just a really simplistic 16th note hat, kind of carrying the groove, carrying the energy along. I also want you to notice that I really don't have any velocity differences with all of these. This is not like the hip hop genre where I was trying to make it feel very human. It's okay if the techno pattern's got a little bit more of a rigid robotic feel to it. Of course, feel free to explore. There's plenty of techno patterns out there that have a more human feel. It really depends on your own personal preference and what you're going for. The last thing I added is extra and just kind of part of this little pattern that I wanted to throw in here. I've got a very soft clap that's just happening on some of the 16th notes. Just a little something to spice this up, although I wouldn't say that it is part of the basics of the techno pattern. These three elements right here should be plenty to get you started, and then from there you can go ahead and add in more sounds and explore. Pattern number 6 is funk. This is a little bit more of a complex pattern. You can see I've got a lot of velocity changes throughout. Let's break it down, starting with the kick. For funk, I like to use a more realistic acoustic drum kit sounding kick. It's got a lot of rumble, about a thump body to it. You could use like a rock kick or a jazz kick for this, whatever you want. And if you notice, I've got a little bit of humanization applied to the timing of these two. These two that are on the 4th 16th note of beats 1 and 2 are a little ahead of the beat. This one right here on the 2nd 8th note of beat 3 is a little behind. I've pulled down the velocity on this little accent kick right here, and it's a little behind the beat as well. Let's just listen to this kick pattern and break it down further. So we've got a very syncopated kick pattern, and syncopated means that we are splitting the beat. We're not playing everything right on the downbeat of each measure, which is beats 1, 2, 3, and 4, or just on the 8th notes either. we've got some 16th notes in here to kind of give it a little more groove, a little more flow. This genre is all about groove. Feel free to play around with this pattern too. Funk is a very open genre. It's not like 4 on the floor or techno or even drum and bass. There's a lot of room as to where you can place the kicks and all the other elements as well. Next thing I added in here was this little jazz snare, which sounds something like this. Just a really tight, nice, light sounding snare. A much busier snare pattern than we have in the other genres. The main snares are happening on the 2 and the 4 though, so I'm going to turn off every snare that's not happening on the 2 and the 4, and we're going to listen to the basics first. That right there could be enough. If you want to stop there, it's totally acceptable. But sometimes it's nice to add in all of these little ghost or accent snares because it helps to give a little more groove and flow and interest to the beat. I'm going to add in a few of these, but I'm going to leave these ones out for now, just so we can see what these little syncopated snares add to the pattern. Now these snares are on the second 16th note of beats 1 and 3. And there's some variety to the velocity of these as well. You can see that this snare is a little bit lower in velocity than this one. The snare and the kick are really kind of starting to play off each other now to create a pretty cool pattern. Let's go ahead and add these final 2 snares in. This is a fast little snare. This is actually a 32nd note pattern here. So we divided the 16th note and we get 32nd notes. And if you notice, these are much lower in velocity than the other snares are. It gives it like a little bit of a almost roll or flam type sound into beat 1 of the next bar. The last thing I did here was add in 16th note snares on the last beat of measure 4, kind of as a fill. Let's move on to the hi-hats. I have a jazzy sounding closed hi-hat here. And I have these on most of the 16th notes, but not all of them, just leaving a few out here or there. But the general pattern is 16th note 1, 3, 4, then 2, 4. And I'm kind of repeating that. 1, 3, 4, 2, 4, 1, 3, 4, 2, 4. And the reason why I've done that is because I've just left space for this snare right here. So every time the snare happens, there's no hi-hat happening. I have these hats at 2 different velocities. And what I'm going to do is, first of all, take away the lower velocity hat. If we take a look at this, we've got a hat on every 3 eighth notes of the bar. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it starts over again. So that gives us like a dotted eighth note feel. When you have a dotted eighth note, what that means is you take an eighth note and then you add half the value of that eighth note right back to it. So what's the half the value of an eighth note? It's a 16th note. So it's an eighth note, which is this long, plus a 16th note, which is this long right here. So add those together and you get 3 16th notes. Just go ahead and turn the metronome on and take a listen to this. Pretty nice flow. We got that like da, 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 da. I think we've heard that pattern all over the place. It's really, really commonly heard. But then if we add back in the softer hat, it just makes the rhythm a little more interesting, fills in some of the empty spaces in the pattern. The last thing I added in here was the jazz open hi-hat. It's got a very long tail to it. Because we have a closed hi-hat and an open hi-hat here together, you might want to put these on the same choke group. So go over to your drum rack, click this little button to open the chains, and then click the little button that says I/O. That's going to show you the input output, and it's also going to reveal this little section called choke. Here you can choose a choke group for your drums. And what a choke group means is that if one drum is playing and another drum starts playing, it's going to cut off the sound that was previously playing. It'll choke it. You can see the closed and open hats are set to choke group 1. So what that means is that when this note plays and the next closed hi-hat comes in, it's going to stop the open hi-hat from playing. That's going to give it a more realistic feel, because when someone is playing a hi-hat, you usually only have one of those in a drum kit, and that can either be open or closed. So you don't usually have an open and closed hi-hat happening at the same time. Let's take a listen to what this adds. Kind of makes it feel like the drummer is just like occasionally opening up the hi-hat just to allow a little bit more of the tail, a bit more of like that cymbal crashy type sound through. This is really providing just a little bit of accent at the end of beat 2, end of beat 4. Again on measure 3, it's at the end of beat 2. At the end here, I've got the velocity turned up a bit higher just to give it more of like a final punctuation mark to the end of the pattern. Pattern number 7 is a jazz swing feel. As far as tempo goes, this can basically be anything from very slow up to very fast. I just chose 130 for this. I thought it sounded good with this pattern. And first of all, I want to talk about what swing is. I made this little 8th note hi-hat pattern to demonstrate this. With everything right on the grid, it sounds like this. But if you want to add a little swing to this, what we want to do is move every other hat back in time a little bit. So I'll take the second one, scoot it back, and I'll do the same with the 4th, 6th, and 8th. So we've delayed all of these in time a little bit. We've kept the 1, 3, 5, and 7 hats on the grid. Now it's going to give it more of a swung feel. Let's take a listen to the jazz swing pattern. So this is all about humanization. The main elements in this are really that snare and the hat and how they're kind of playing with each other. And there's a lot of velocity differences in this genre. You want to have a very human feel when you're making jazz. If it sounds too robotic, it's not going to come across the right way. I'm going to turn everything but this ride cup tip sample off. So this is basically a sample where they're playing on like the middle part of the cymbal, which is like the kind of rounded bell part of it. And it gives it more of like a higher kind of ringy sound. You get a lot of the attack from the stick and less of the wash of the actual cymbal sound. I'll turn the metronome on and we'll play this. So we can see the basic pattern here is just playing on 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the bar. But we have these little accents in here too, which is what's giving it kind of a swung feel. These little accent beats are pretty far behind the 8th note. They're actually kind of more on the 16th note of the bar. But take a look at what happens if I move these to the 8th note. It's going to lose all of its swinginess. It really needs to be kind of played just before beat 1 of the next hit. And feel free to add these in wherever, explore, right? There's no true right way to do this. You just gotta do what sounds good. And always remember to add variation into the velocity. Working from top down, we're gonna add a crash in next, just on beat 1 of the first measure. It shows this really nice crash dry session. And I've got the velocity down pretty far, so it's a pretty quiet crash. The next thing I've added in here is this little closed hi-hat sound. It's a pretty deep hi-hat, and I'm always going for more realistic sounds here, more of an acoustic drum sound when I'm making jazz type patterns. And this is just going to be on beat 2 and 4 of every measure. Out of all the drums, this one's doing the most work to hold down the groove of the pattern, right? We just got 1, 2, 4, 2, 4. It's keeping everything really locked in. Still some groove, still some variation as to when these are happening. You're going to want to do that for basically all of these sounds. Next, I added in this rock snare, but I've got it really, really quiet. The velocity is low on all of these. And this is a very syncopated snare pattern. The first one happens on the 4th 16th note of beat 4 of measure 1. So these are all sort of happening generally around the 4th 16th note of each of these beats. We've got one in beat 4 of measure 1, beat 2, 3, and 4 of measure 2, 2, 3, and 4 of measure 3, and just a little bit of variation here in measure 5. We've got a little more variation here in the second half, a bit of a busier snare pattern. And you can see I've got this one turned up much higher. That's just going to provide a little bit of accent to that one part. You'll oftentimes hear jazz drummers just throwing a little bit more of a harder snare in there every once in a while, just to kind of like, pop that one out and give a little variation. Lots of room for exploration here. This is by no means like the pattern you have to use. I definitely recommend you start with something a little more basic like the first half, and then add that into the second half and just start adding in a few snares here and there, seeing what you like. The kick is extremely sparse. I have a kick on the downbeat of measure 1, beat 1 of measure 1, and then I have a kick on beat 1 of measure 7. And that's it. It's mostly all done up here in the snares and cymbals. So altogether, it sounds like this. At the end, you notice that I do have a lot more of the snares louder than they are in the first half. That, once again, is just sort of a way to put a little bit of like a turnaround or a almost fill-like feel to the end of this phrase to let the listener know that this phrase is done. We're moving on to the next one. Up next, we have your classic rock pattern. Rock can be at a variety of different tempos. I chose 84 for this one because I thought it sounded good. It sounds like this. Pretty basic, pretty simple. Let's start with the kick. Chose kind of a boomy acoustic sounding kick for this. Lots of attack. There's a lot of range and variety with the style of kick that you can use. You can really go for anything. You can go for a much meatier, heavier sounding kick if you want. Really depends on the kind of rock you're making. There are so many different types of rock subgenres. There's grunge, there's punk, you've got indie rock, blues rock, math rock, gothic rock, progressive. It goes on. And they all have different styles and different feels, so you just got to use whatever you feel sounds the best for the kind of rock music that you are making. The kick pattern here is pretty simple. It's the same thing repeated each time. I've got a kick on beat 1, measure 1. Then I got a kick on the second 8th note of beat 2 of measure 1. And then I've got a kick on beat 3 of measure 1. And then I just repeat that for every measure. I did put a little bit of timing change in here for each one of these, just to once again give it more of a human feel. Typically for rock drums, you're going to actually have a drummer playing it in. It's not generally an electronic music genre where the drums are programmed, so it's important, just like in funk and jazz, to make the drums feel a little more human by doing velocity changes and timing offsets. Snare is on the 2 and the 4 of every measure, except for the last measure here where I also put it on the and of beat 3 in measure 4. Just to add, once again, bit of a fill, bit of a variation to let the listener know the phrase is done. The type of snare I used is a pretty realistic acoustic sounding snare. And the kick and the snare together sound like this. Notice the snare I added in here on beat 3 has got a bit of a lower velocity than the other ones. It's more of like an extra accent. Kind of like in the jazz one, I added in a ride cymbal that's being played on the cup or the bell, that middle part of the cymbal like I was talking about. And that is just riding right along on every 8th note all the way through. Just providing that rhythm, just keeping everything locked together, keeps the energy of the drum pattern moving forward. The last thing I added here was a crash on beat 1 of the pattern. Just like in many of these other ones, I like to add a crash on beat 1. You oftentimes hear this as kind of like the announcement that boom, this phrase is starting over again. Just found this little classic 505 crash, but you can use any sort of realistic sounding crash for this. Altogether, it sounds like this. Up next, we have Reggaeton. You hear this in all kinds of pop music. I mean, it's really heavily used in EDM genres as well. I put mine at 100 BPM. You find this anywhere between 80 and 110 BPM typically. This is another one of those 4 on the floor patterns where we have the kick on beat 1 of every single bar. But the main difference is the snare pattern. I'll turn off all the cymbals and let's just listen to the snare and the kick playing off each other. The important thing here is the pattern of the snare. So the snare is on the first 16th note of beat 1 and then the second 8th note of beat 2. And that really gives this drum pattern its very distinctive sound. I use just a more reggae style kick, kind of thuddy, short, acoustic sounding, and this reggae snare, which has got a really open, ringy, kind of high-pitched sound to it. Like the previous few genres, we're going to want to humanize this and make it feel like a person's actually playing it. So I've moved these off the grid a little bit, but notice that a lot of these are behind the beat, as opposed to being a little bit in front like that. That's what's going to give this its laid back kind of feel, right? Reggae is all about laid back, chill. You don't want to be feeling like you're pushing it ahead of the beat. For example, I just moved all these snares. Instead of being a little behind the beat, they're a little ahead of the beat. And just take a listen to how weird this sounds. Kind of loses all of its groove and coolness and flow. You really want that a little later and behind. Let's add in the hat. For this, I just used a little closed tech hat. I thought it sounded good. I honestly don't know if it's really genre appropriate, but I feel like there's some openness here. Like I said before, just explore and use what you think sounds good, as long as it's not totally inappropriate for the genre. And really all I'm doing here is just kind of filling in space with this hat, trying to find a cool pattern. The general idea is it's happening on the second 8th note of every measure, right? We've got one here, 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 and here. And then I just added in a few extras here and there just to spice it up. I've got ones on the first 2 16th notes of beat 3. I've got another one on the first beat of beat 2. I've got another one on the first beat of measure 2. And that kind of repeats all the way through. I should also note that I repeated the snare here at the end. I've got the snare on the 3rd and 4th 16th notes of beat 4 in measure 4. Next, I added in an open hat on the 2 and the 4 of every single bar. This is usually where we put the snare in most genres, unless we're doing like a halftime feel. So this open hat is really doing all the work to kind of hold this beat down and keep everything locked together. Last thing I did was, once again, add a crash on beat 1. I just used a standard rock crash. Last but not least, we have the disco pattern. Pretty wide range for the tempo here. It can be anywhere between 100 to 140 BPM. I just chose 110 for this pattern. Let's take a listen to see how it sounds. Another 4 on the floor based drum pattern, a little more similar to the very first pattern we started with, right? It's a little closer to house. We've got the kick on the downbeat of every single measure. We've got the snare on beat 2 and beat 4, just like in the 4 and floor pattern. And then at the end, I added in a little bit of like a snare fill or a snare turnaround where I increased the velocity over time just to kind of give it like a sense of finality into the end of the pattern. The kick's got a pretty thumpy electronic feel to it with like a nice sharp attack. The snare has a bit of a drum machine-y type feel to it. You can hear there's a bit of gated reverb on this as well. I feel like disco is a very, 70s, 80s genre, and that gated snare effect was used quite a bit back then. I've got a little bit of variation in the timing. I could probably do with a little bit less of this, particularly in the hats, but play around, see what sounds good to you. Next, we add in a closed hat. Very much a drum machine sort of sounding hat. And all I'm doing here is filling in space, usually just putting them where the kick and the snare are not. Got a pretty wonky pattern on this. I could probably put these back on the grid a little more. It might feel better, but I do sometimes kind of like that weird wonkiness. So each one of these little groups has a bit of an increase in velocity. So we've got the first one down here, the second one a little higher, and the third one higher than that. So that each one of these bars kind of goes woo into the next beat. So it just increases in energy all the way through. I left room here at the end of measure 2 because we've got some other cymbals to play. Let's add those in. We've got a closed and open hat here. These two are pretty quiet. I could probably turn them up a little bit. These are both on the same choke group along with the other cymbal as well. That's why we're hearing the open hats cut off. Last thing, you guessed it, we got a crash right there on beat 1. Altogether, it sounds like this. There you have it. That's 10 essential drum patterns that no matter what genre you produce, you should know and you're probably going to end up using at some point. If you listen to a lot of different styles and genres of music, you're going to hear these patterns everywhere. Lots of pop and halftime and dubstep draws inspiration from reggae. You hear that jazzy swing feel in all sorts of genres that aren't jazz. And 4 on the floor is universally used in a lot of different types of genres that aren't necessarily house music. So I highly recommend you get familiar with these genres and others as well, and you'll end up being a really well-rounded producer who's able to draw inspiration from across lots of different genres and work that into your own music.